Welcome to our live webcast of Day 2 of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion series, Bias Awareness and Socialization. Before we start our presentation, I want to review some logistics. At any time, you may adjust your audio using any computer volume settings that you may have. This session will be recorded and made available on the NCSEA website. Earlier today, you received an email with a link to this presentation as well as a participant's guide. You will need this guide throughout the presentation. You may also download it from the link in the chat. On the bottom of your screen, you will see the Q&A pod. To send a question, click in the text box and type your text. When finished, click the send button or push enter. All questions that you submit are only seen by today's presenter and will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Discussion is encouraged as we go throughout the series. You'll be encouraged at several points during the presentation to use the chat pod to discuss the topics presented today with your fellow attendees and speakers. At this time, I will turn the floor over to the NCSEA Treasurer, David Horos, for opening remarks.
Thank you, Kat. Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to today's second webinar in NCSEA's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion series. And I'd like to thank you for taking the time today to join us in learning more about these important topics. I will be joined today by NCSEA President Emily Guglielmo and our speaker, Shani Barracks-Moore. In reality, as those of you who attended the first webinar know, I'm actually the new guy on the block today. I suppose I'm here to provide some gender diversity. I'll do my best not to bring down the proceedings, as I thought Shani and Emily did an excellent job with the first webinar. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone about the joint call to action for the structural engineering profession that was developed by CASE, SEI, and NCSEA and announced in June. The call pledges that our organizations will, 1, engage our collective power to bring about real and lasting change. It's a marathon, not a sprint, as Emily mentioned in the previous seminar. 2, collaborate to promote equity, diversity, and inclusion. 3, urge support and encourage our members to speak out. And 4, ensure open communications so all our members can be informed and be heard. Beyond the joint call, NCSEA's board developed a list of items for action by our organization. Emily reviewed those with us in the first webinar. At a high level, some of the actions include an information and educational effort by our SE3 committee, this DEI series, using NCSEA's newly formed foundation to help fund scholarships for underrepresented students, and to explore additional opportunities for collaboration with other engineering and technical organizations. As a quick reminder for those who were unable to attend, the first webinar of the series was entitled Cultural Humility and the U in Unity. A recording of this webinar is available, free for viewing, with links that can be found on NCSEA's website. The links can be reached from NCSEA's homepage under the Events tab by clicking on DEI Series. There are 2 links highlighted in red on the DEI page that will take you to the recording. The third and final session of the series is entitled, How Do We Progress Towards Racial Equity in the Structural Engineering Community? It will be held on November 5th and is part of this year's summit. While the summit is a paid event, a recording will be available free of this session after November 5th and posted to the website. Today's session is entitled Bias Awareness and Socialization. Leading us today, as she did in the first session, is Shani Barracks-Moore. Shani is a strategic diversity and inclusion practitioner with 20 years of experience in training and development, strategic planning and change leadership, and coalition building. Shani currently serves as a Director of Diversity and Inclusion at the University of North Texas, where she leads a learning and development team, executes planning and delivery of the Equity and Diversity Conference, and develops strategic partnerships for the university. We look forward to today's session, and with that, I now welcome Shani Barracks-Moore.
Good morning and hello to everyone who is joining us today. I am going to go ahead and share my screen and get us started. And so I appreciate the introduction, Dave, and you mentioning the last session. Today we are going to talk about bias awareness and socialization. And as Kat mentioned, please do access your participant guide, and we hope that you have had an opportunity to take your chosen implicit association test, as that will be part of today's session. So today what we're going to do is we're going to build upon cultural humility through bias awareness. We talked about cultural humility last time, and we're going to build on that by exploring our own biases via the Harvard Implicit Association Test that you all hopefully had the opportunity to participate in, and how they're developed through socialization. And then finally, we're going to discuss the influence of biases and socialization on inclusive practices. Today's session is really going to give you an opportunity to do some additional reflection, and we really encourage you to think about how this topic applies to your respective roles within your respective firms, whether it's also within the Structural Engineering Association, and just as a citizen, as a good citizen, to really practice bias awareness and cultural humility. So just a quick review. If you recall, last time we gave you an opportunity to explore your own dimensions of diversity and to really think about which ones have the most impact on your perspectives, experiences, and interactions. And then we were reminded that most of these are hidden, that is why intentional inclusion is so important, because the only thing that we can tell from looking at someone, and that's if we don't have a visual impairment, is appearance. And so then we also were introduced to this notion of cultural humility, which is a paradigm shift from cultural competence in the 20th century. Cultural humility acknowledges the importance, the presence and importance of differences. And we talked about how it's okay to notice that I'm a Black woman, that me being Black and a woman has a lot to do with my own perceptions, experiences, and interactions. And that cultural humility is a lifelong process of self-reflection and self-critique, and that bias awareness, which is what we're going to talk about today, is a critical part of cultural humility to really be able to realize the benefits of an intentionally inclusive and diverse environment. And then finally, we talked a bit about equality versus equity, with equality being the 20th century paradigm and it being something like the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, which is more about sameness. It's giving everybody the same thing. Whereas equity is the platinum rule, and it's about being fair, and fair is not always equal. So the platinum rule is doing unto others as they would have them, have you do unto them. But you have to be able to practice cultural humility to be able to practice equity. And with justice being akin to this notion of social responsibility that many of us are undertaking within our respective associations and firms. And so now I'd like to turn it over to Emily and Dave to really just share with us some of the takeaways that you got from the previous session and how you think it applies to structural engineering. So Emily, would you, or Dave, would you like to go first?
Yes, thanks, Shani. I took kind of at a high level two takeaways. One, I really appreciated the opportunity to, in my mind, clean up some terminology and think about some definitions and what some of the words really mean. And by that, I mean discussion about compliance versus inclusion, and really thinking about the difference between those two. Similarly, sensitivity and tolerance as they may compare to understanding and acceptance. And second, at a high level, just being introduced to some of the new concepts that you just reviewed, Shani. Items like the 20th century paradigm, colorblindness versus acknowledging differences, cultural humility and what it means to be humble in a cultural sense, the awareness continuum and how increasing understanding leads to appreciation, and the U in unity. My takeaway was, in order to encourage and contribute to unity, you really have to know yourself. How much of that specifically relates to the structural engineering community? That's a question, but I think that all of it probably does in one way or another.
Thanks, Dave. Emily, how about you?
Thanks, Jenny, and thanks, Dave. I very much enjoyed session one. The one takeaway that I really brought home and has resonated with me, and I'll be honest, at home, at work, is the idea that equality and fairness aren't the same thing. And that equality is really giving everyone the same thing or same amount, regardless of the circumstances. And that fairness is about giving people what they need and what they deserve. So I've tried to use this just in my day-to-day. I mentioned whether it's parenting my children or mentoring my staff, I feel like that differentiation has been really eye-opening and important for me.
Great, thank you. Thank you both for sharing that. And hopefully that serves as a bit of a review for those of us that weren't able to join us last time. But those of you who weren't, hopefully you kind of feel like you were there. We hope that today's session is going to build upon what we talked about in the last session. So for the purposes of level setting, I'd like to just first talk about the difference between explicit and implicit bias. And just for the purposes of our discussion, bias we will define as an unfair preference for or dislike of something. And it's unfair primarily because it's unexamined, right? Implicit biases are clear and obvious, and implicit biases are implied and not stated, but they're understood in what's expressed. So explicit bias, it's conscious, it's deliberate, it's conspicuous and identifiable. So most of us have, say, a favorite song, a favorite color, a favorite flavor of ice cream, and we act upon that because we know what our preference for or dislike of something is. And so it's conscious and deliberate. However, implicit bias, that's a little different in that it's unconscious, it's often denied. I know, we'll talk about the Implicit Association Test a little bit. And, I certainly wasn't happy with many of my results when I take those tests. But I often like to say that we give you the gift of bias awareness so that they go from being insidious to being conspicuous and identifiable, because a lot of times that's what happens with biases, is that because they're hidden, they do become insidious and they kind of creep up on us in ways that we don't really understand or know about or realize until we have that gift of bias awareness. So I also want to talk a little bit about some different types of bias that will help us to understand the impact of biases on our practices in structural engineering and otherwise. And so one of the first types of biases is affinity bias. And this is one that we're probably familiar with. It's known as similarity bias, or, you've heard the term like attracts like. It's the tendency that people have to connect with others who share similar interests, experiences, and backgrounds. And I think we often see this in our social circles, that a lot of times our social circles may look a lot like us. The people that we spend our discretionary time with may look a lot like us. So because we have an affinity for people with whom we share common characteristics. So confirmation bias is another type of bias. And that's the inclination to draw conclusions about a situation or person based upon your personal desires, beliefs, and prejudices, rather than on unbiased merit. So that might be, maybe you have an assumption that everybody that goes to a particular school, for example, is either good or bad, right? Or I know that person was, if we're looking at it in terms of hiring, that person was referred by thus and such. I know that person, he's a good guy, so I can pretty much confirm that this person will be a good guy, just like the person that referred him. So that's an example of confirmation bias. Attribution bias, that's trying to make sense of or judge a person's behavior based upon prior observations and interactions you've had with that individual that makes up your perception of them. So maybe you met them at a conference, or maybe, I don't know, you had and that can go both ways. That can go both positively or negatively. Maybe you had a small interaction with them at a previous firm, and you're making an assumption that you're going to interact with them and you're going to attribute the same characteristics that they had maybe in that similar firm, but you might not be taking into account that maybe the culture of that firm was different. The values, beliefs, and norms within that firm's culture was different, and that person may not actually operate in the same way in your firm and in your interaction with them now as they did before. And then conformity bias, this is also known as groupthink. The tendency people have to act similarly to the people around them, regardless of their own personal beliefs or idiosyncrasies, also known as peer pressure. So we've probably all been in a meeting before where, you're brainstorming about a topic and you're just kind of throwing stuff up against the wall. And one person says, yeah, I think that's a good idea. And then everyone else just kind of joins in. And conformity bias happens in particular when you couple that conformity bias even with positional power. So that's why it's sometimes helpful for, say, partners or other folks that are, particularly when you're in ideation mode, right? That to maybe have people who have more positional power to kind of hang back a little bit, because the peer pressure to conform with the ideas that the most senior person has in the room can sometimes contribute to this kind of bias. And so there's also something known as the halo or horns effect, and you've probably heard of this before. So the halo effect is the tendency of placing another person on a pedestal after learning something impressive about them. So maybe it's that they went to a particular school. I'm from North Carolina, so maybe hearing that they went to North Carolina State University's engineering school, for example, that may place a halo effect on that person. But conversely, the horns effect is the tendency of viewing another person negatively after learning something unpleasant or negative about them. So maybe you worked with someone at a previous firm or in your firm that went to a school, and maybe you didn't particularly like that person. It could have been that that person maybe was just a little bit of a jerk, right? It probably didn't have anything to do with where they went to school, but you may be attributing that horns effect to someone who went to a similar school or has a similar background to someone that maybe just got on your nerves that day, and that you might be unfairly attributing some negative characteristics to them. And then there's the contrast effect. And this is something that I have to watch myself, particularly in a hiring setting. That's comparing two or more things that you've come into contact with either simultaneously or one after the other, causing you to exaggerate the performance of one in contrast to the other. So, in my day job as the Director of Diversity and Inclusion, we're actually in the middle of hiring a new trainer, and I had to be really mindful of that and not comparing one candidate to the first candidate that we had. And I thought the first candidate was really awesome. So trying to make sure that I'm not creating that contrast effect and comparing everybody to my favorite, right? And that's something that we all sometimes maybe slip into without really realizing that we're doing it. But again, that gift of bias awareness helps us to be more cognizant of the fact that we may be doing it. And so then there are identity-based types of bias that you've probably heard about. There's gender bias, which obviously that was something that was measured in the gender career test, and to some degree in the gender science test as well. And that's the tendency typically to prefer men over women. There's age bias. And, I'm in higher education. So, we often say in higher education that there's kind of a sweet spot that usually people tend to prefer those that are younger. But we often talk about this in higher education, that many of our younger faculty and staff say that they feel more marginalized because they're not older. And our older faculty and staff may feel more marginalized because they're seen as older and maybe less relevant. And we often talk about that sweet spot sort of in the 40s, where you're old enough to kind of know what it is you're talking about and not necessarily be patronized, but you're still young enough to kind of still be relevant. And that probably varies, I would say, probably from profession to profession on where that sweet spot is in terms of age bias. Beauty bias is a thing. Pretty privilege is a thing. The more attractive someone is, oftentimes the more drawn you are to them. And that also kind of goes with height and weight bias, that studies have shown that taller people are actually considered to be more preferred. And, I call that vertical privilege. I'm a taller person. So I have seen to some degree some of that benefit of that vertical privilege. It's certainly coming in handy these days with the COVID 15 or 20. It kind of stretches me out a little bit more. And that's where some of that weight bias can come in too. And then finally, there's name bias, which we've probably heard a lot about this in the news. I don't know if so much lately, but it's certainly come out within the last 10 to 15 years that sometimes, they've done research that you might have one resume where the name is Kevin Jones and another resume where it's Jamal Jones, and all things being equal, for whatever reason, the Kevin Jones resume may move to the next level in the process, and the Jamal Jones or the Jorge Sanchez, for example, won't, because of the name bias that exists primarily against Black and African American and Latinx names. It also happens with international names as well. And I will admit, I kind of succumbed to this, that we were very intentional about giving our children very racially nondescript names. So we've got one named Kayla Simone and another one named Andrea Elise for that very reason, because I'd seen the prevalence of name bias. That also goes to with some schools that a lot of times historically Black colleges and universities have been found to be marginalized or discriminated against when they come across recruiters' desks, because they presume that that person is a person of color. So all of these are a number of different types of biases that can really affect our ability to be objective in a given situation. So this is actually why we had you take the Harvard Implicit Association Test. And for many people, this may be the first time that they have taken the test, although it's been out for quite some time. It was developed in 1998 by psychologists at Harvard, UVA, and the University of Washington to measure implicit biases. The thing I love about this test is it's kind of like if anyone out there plays spades, it's like you think long, you think wrong, that it determines initial unconscious reactions to visual stimuli. And I've noticed that when people try to consciously think about the pictures that they see, it won't give you a result. That the results are only calculated if you provide those spontaneous, not deliberate actions. And that kind of speaks to its validity too, that it changes up the pictures on you sometimes and it kind of confuses you, but it does that on purpose to kind of change that paradigm of what we typically associate, one group with good and another group with bad. And this is what Project Implicit has said, is that it's been functioning as a hands-on science museum exhibit, allowing web visitors to experience the manner in which human minds display the effects of stereotypic and prejudicial associations acquired from their sociocultural environment. So the reality is, though you probably weren't really digging your implicit association test results, I certainly was not, there's probably a sociocultural reason, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, how we may have been socialized to have some of the biases that we discovered through the implicit association test. And you probably noticed there are a ton of different tests that you can take, but we had you choose from one of these 6 tests. The skin tone test, which shows you how much you may associate lighter skin with good and darker skin with bad. I prefer that one to the race test because the race test is really more binary. It's more black and white. The age test shows you pictures of younger folks or older folks to see how much you may associate young or old with good or bad. The weight test does the same thing, how much you may associate good or bad with heavier set people or thinner people. The mental illness test is a newer test, and that is where it's associating whether you associate mental illness with dangerous and physical illness with not as dangerous. And then the gender, career, and gender science tests, those are the ones that are really cool, where the gender career one, I will say, is the one that maybe I wasn't as upset with my results because it showed that I had little to no preference between men related to career and women related to home, because both of my parents were English professors, and for the first couple of years of my life, they kind of did their schedules around each other. So I was with both of them equally until I was about 3 years old. The gender science test shows how much you associate one gender with sciences and another gender with the humanities. And it just so happens that our friends Emily and Dave took these tests and are willing to share their results with us and how they think maybe those results were developed. So Emily, how about you share with us which test you took and where you think those results came from?
Sure. I took the gender career test. So as you mentioned, I was associating male, female with career and family. And I guess I'd like to preface it with, I so strongly believe in a woman's ability to have a successful career and a man's ability to be a strong contributor to the family. Like you, I grew up in a household where both my mom and my dad worked. My mom and my dad both cooked and cleaned and cared for me and my sisters. I had a really strong example of a professional mom and a family-focused dad. And I continue to live my life with a desire for that balance. If you guys promise not to tell my husband, I'll admit to you that if we did a fair evaluation of our split and family responsibilities, he would probably come up on top with home and kid duties. And I'm certainly the person who brings home the career stress, works longer hours, and travels. So when Shani suggested I take the gender career test, I thought I was going to ace it. And as I took the exam, I was pretty sure I was being really intentional, methodical, and correct. When I got my answers, I was wrong. So take a deep breath before I share it with you, but my results showed that I have a strong association, a strong automatic association for male with career and female with family. So when that popped up on the screen, I was ready to go to the mat. I was pretty upset with my results, but I gave it a little bit of pause and gave it some review and introspection. And I realized that there's a lot that went into it, not just the right answer, but the pace of my responses. And so I decided, rather than trying to fight my score, I'm going to lean into it. I'm going to accept my results and acknowledge that even people that are deeply committed to diversity and consciously trying to do the right thing are sometimes influenced by their backgrounds, experiences, or even just the way their brains work. So the fact that my brain creates a bias is humbling. I'm trying to convince myself it's nothing to feel guilty about. So I've tried to make notes to myself about ways I can do things differently in the future. For example, to regularly check in on myself and see if these biases are influencing my decisions, to be a little wary of first impressions. If I find myself immediately drawn to someone or put off by someone, I need to be a little bit more cautious, and to challenge myself to more exposure to new and different experiences. I feel like if I can expose myself to new things, I can change my unfamiliar into familiar. So with that being said, I hope you guys were able to take the test. If you're anything like me, there may have been a little shock factor, but I don't I don't disagree with my results. I am not surprised with a little bit of thought about my results. And while I had a strong example in front of me with my nuclear family, if I start to broaden my experiences, I can start to understand why these biases have come into my brain and the way that I implicitly am thinking. So there's my fair assessment of my test results.
Thank you, Emily, for your vulnerability. Dave, what did you have, my friend?
Shani, I took the gender science test, which checked associations of male and female with, as you mentioned, science and liberal arts. And I'm going to start right at the finish line and just say that I was found to have a strong automatic association for male with science and female with liberal arts. And I probably, now looking back, shouldn't be surprised about that. But when I first saw the results, I was surprised and disappointed because that's not how I see myself. While I'm an engineer by education and profession, as most of us are, I don't always think of myself as an engineer. I have an idea that I'm a well-rounded person with a variety of interests, including liberal arts, with a particular interest in music. And I try to be aware of biases. And while I would never say that I don't have any, particularly after learning what we're learning, I do feel like I do what I can to act in ways I believe are impartial and unbiased. I do know people who I believe are biased in various ways, and I hope that I'm not. I hope that I'm different, but thus my surprise and disappointment a little bit with the results. So, I asked myself, why might this be? Clearly, I have an interest and aptitude in technical subjects. Like most of us, I've always been good at math, which led me to engineering. I read a lot, but it's generally all nonfiction. So while I do have an interest and experience with music in particular, it's not probably to the same extent as with technical subjects. But this alone doesn't help me understand why I associate male with science and female with liberal arts, other than I'm male and my association is probably more with science. But is it because the larger percentage of my fellow engineering colleagues are male? Is it because a larger percentage of the leader in the profession I associate are male? Maybe some of all of that. So here are some other personal thoughts related to me that have come to mind, and please don't hold any of this against me. I went to an all-male high school, and many of my teachers were male. At least many more than I would imagine would be at a co-ed high school. And I shudder to say this, but I can't recall a single female engineering professor during my undergrad or graduate school career. I'm worried that this implicit bias has made me forget someone. And I didn't do a thorough review, but my recollection is I didn't have any female professors in college. I did in other subjects, but not in any engineering subjects. And at the same time, I am sure that most of my fellow engineering student colleagues were male. Throughout my career, I can think of a few females who were senior to me, but most of my bosses and senior mentor types have all been male. Both of my parents had somewhat technical professions. My dad was in the military, and that seems to be technical and male environment. My mom was in office management and bookkeeping. It's not as if I've had no females in my life with science backgrounds. My sister is a physical therapist and my wife is an economist and a banker. But I have to assume that these limited experiences, while close to me, are probably not enough to balance the examples of males I've experienced related to science over many years. So overall, I would suggest, and I'm not an expert in this by any stretch of the imagination, a general predominant experience with males and science has resulted in this strong association. I don't particularly like that, and I am willing to accept it based on my background. So that's me, Shani.
Thank you, Dave. That's a really great, that's going to be helpful for what we're going to have folks do in a little bit, and really think about how their biases were developed. And I really appreciate you both sharing that. I want to share one concept, though, that I think is really relevant considering what we all just shared about our results. You know, some of my results were kind of negative to some of my own characteristics. But what that is internalized oppression. And that occurs when members of both advantaged and targeted groups, so these would be the groups for which there would be more privilege, and in the IAT, those would be the groups where usually people associate good with those groups. And targeted groups are the groups that usually you associate bad characteristics with those. So it's when members of those groups adopt the dominant ideology about their own groups that maintains and reinforces oppression. As part of their socialization process, which we're going to get into, members of both groups internalize social messages about their own groups, as well as messages about other groups. So if you think about the gender career and the gender science, for example, so internalized domination is when members of the advantaged group, in this case for the gender science, that would be male, and for gender career, that would be male. When members of the advantaged group, males, accept their group social superior status as normal and deserved. So the example that you see here is, for example, heterosexuals who believe that only heterosexuals can be good parents. It could be, for the purposes of this discussion, males who believe that it's primarily males that can be good engineers. Might be an example of internalized domination that can maybe even show up in your hiring practices. Same thing, internalized subordination. That may be an example of what Emily described, when members of targeted groups internalize the dominant social messages of inferiority about their group. So the example I have here is certainly for me in a higher ed setting, a person with a learning disability who thinks they can't attend college or feels ashamed to use a campus's disability services. That might also happen in the workplace, where you have someone that is due an accommodation per the ADA, but just wants to kind of push through it because of the stigma that's often attached to disabilities and sharing disabilities. That happens very often with mental illness, by the way. And, you know, for my own results, you know, it showed that I strongly associate mental illness with dangerous. And for me, you know, because I've just seen instances in my family of mental illness being associated with danger, but mental illness is the quickest growing disability that we have out there. And you know, this COVID stage that we're in doesn't really help. So this notion of internalized oppression, you know, is very relevant and akin to this bias awareness, because you may have found that you have biases that are related to groups that you are members of. And that is normal because of this process of socialization that we'll talk about. And so socialization is really just learning through interactions with a number of different entities, individuals that you love and trust, institutions such as schools and professions, and culture, various societal norms. And these include systems of oppression, kind of we just talked about with internalized oppression, privilege, and power dynamics. And the thing about socialization is that it permeates through people who are really influential in our lives, peers, parents, teachers. You know, Dave talked about not having any male engineering teachers, and that obviously had a lot to do with his socialization that probably was related to his results. Certainly had a lot to do with my socialization. You know, one of the ones that I think of also is skin tone, which shows that I have a preference for lighter skin, but obviously as a Black woman, I have darker skin, but I've been socialized that lighter is seen to be better or more attractive. And so that came through in my results. So there's a cycle of socialization, and we've actually included this in your participant guide on page 5. And it will be helpful to follow along here because you're going to actually engage with this cycle of socialization in a moment as it relates to your IET results. But we're going to break this down. You're not going to have to look at, all of this on this one screen. We're going to break this down so that you can see maybe the stages of your socialization and how you may have potentially been socialized through this process to have some of the biases that you discovered. So in the beginning, we're a blank slate, right? We're born into the world with no biases, no consciousness, no choice, no guilt. It's kind of like that age-old saying, when you sit 2 kids in a sandbox, people just play, right? But then something happens, usually between ages 0 to 5, where you're taught on that personal level by parents, relatives, teachers, people that you love and trust, the shapers of expectations, the goods and the bads, the norms. Yes, you can play with this, but no, you can't play with that. It happens with boys and girls and how we gender toys, right? That with a boy, we give them trucks and things to play with, and with girls, we give them dolls. So that's that first socialization. The one for me that I often think about is, I went to private school when I was younger. I was one of a few Black kids in my private school. We were scheduling a slumber party, and one of my friends came up to me and just said, "Hey, my mom says that I can't come to your house because you're Black," and just kind of walked off in a very matter-of-fact way. And that was my first socialization at 7, that there must be something wrong with being Black, and that stuck with me. And again, that goes back to my implicit association test results, right? So that happens usually ages 0 to 5. Then as you start entering into institutions and we get old enough to remember some of these reinforcements, institutions like, you notice this has some Christian privilege here. It says churches, but we've added temples or synagogues because not everyone worships in a church or worships at all, right? Schools, television, legal system, mental health system, medicine, business, culture, things like song lyrics, media, patterns of thought. And keeping in mind that structural engineering is an example of an agent of socialization that is an institution. And these things are enforced, sanctioned, stigmatized. You see that there are people that get rewards and punishments. Privilege exists just by virtue of who is there and who isn't, right? And so in many cases, it's men that are there. It is predominantly white men that are there, and women are often not part of that equation. And so you get socialized into thinking that that's kind of how it should be. And Emily, you had an example of that as well, of being socialized within engineering too, huh?
Yeah, thanks, Shani. And I guess to speak to that socialization, I'm going to share a story with you guys. And it's a story that I've intentionally not shared very widely, but it has contributed pretty significantly to me in my career path. That being said, it is the second time I've now shared this story, and they both happen to be this past month. So apologies to those of you who are hearing it for the second time. But when I was really young, I was convinced I was going to be a teacher. And as I progressed through high school, I found myself pretty good at math and science, and I had people tell me I'd be a good engineer. I didn't have an engineering parent or family member, so I didn't really know what that would look like. Luckily for me, my parents were pretty big advocates, and they helped me enroll in a community college class when I was a senior in high school, and the class was called Careers in Engineering and Technology. In the class, the teacher brought in various engineers to speak with us each week, and when the civil engineer joined our weekly class, I worked up the courage in the back of the room, being the only high schooler, to raise my hand and say, if I want to be a civil engineer, what should I work on? And his response to me was, well, to the boys in the class, focus on your math and science. And for the girls, refine your organizational skills, because the boys are in the pickup trucks, they're jumping in, the running to job sites, the drawings are going everywhere, and we really need the girls back in the office to keep us organized. Obviously, that didn't sit really well with me, and my teacher tried to intervene to soften the blow. I found myself outside the classroom, civil engineer, the teacher, and me. And the civil engineer really stood by his opinion. He just stated it as fact. And so I told him that someday I was going to be an engineer, and I would even have men working for me. So with that, I went home. As a high schooler, I changed all my college applications to read engineering. And so I'll say personally, not my most strategic move, but it worked out pretty well for me. But I can imagine that the outcome of that exchange for people without the same level of support or maybe the same level of sass probably don't enter our profession. That socialization affects you and affects your confidence and your ability to reach out and do something that's outside of your comfort zone or your norm.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Emily. That's a really good example of how some of these norms are enforced, sanctioned, stigmatized. There are rewards and punishments. In this case, there's a reward for being a boy and a punishment for being a girl. And so you clearly saw who had privilege and who was empowered in that case. And I have to tell you that, you know, working in higher ed, you know, a lot of times people will say that their most critical socializations happened in the college years, you know, when they're deciding to what it is they're going to major in, what it is they want to be when they grow up, right? But I think that's important for us too, as we're looking at internships, that we make sure that we are equally affirming everyone so that we are creating diverse and equitable pipelines into engineering. And so what are the results for that? So there's dissonance, you know, a lot of times there's cognitive dissonance if you know, you think that you've been told your whole life that I can do this, and then if you continue to hear that because you're a woman or a person of color or insert whatever identity there that you can't, you know, there's dehumanization, there's guilt, there's ignorance, there's self-hatred, there's horizontal violence, which really just means that sometimes, you know, women can sometimes be nasty to other women and be harder on other women. That also happens in communities of color, right? So you can do nothing and just say, oh, well, that's the way it is, and promote the status quo. What we hope we're doing today is raising your consciousness so that you can interrupt this cycle and educate and reframe and re-question and sort of raise your consciousness about this. So that's what we're actually going to give you an opportunity to do now. So I invite you to go to your participant guide, and if you go to pages 4 to 9 of your participant guide should look like this. And if you go to pages 4 to 9, it's after the cycle of socialization. And the cycle of socialization is here. And then there are a number of different questions that ask you, that want you to think about your IAT test results. So if you took skin tone, if you took gender career, if you took gender science, think about your IAT test results in this cycle of socialization. And there are these socializations on every page. And so what were your first per socializations about skin tone, about gender, about weight, about age, about any of those identities that are associated with the implicit association test? So first, we want you to, on page 6, to think about those first personal socializations. Then as you go to page 7, how are those messages reinforced? By what institutions and cultural elements were they reinforced? What were the conscious and unconscious messages, and how do you think these influence the biases that you discovered that you had through the implicit association test? Then it goes on to page 8, where it asks about enforcements. What rewards and punishments did you observe from you or others possessing the preferred dominant? And this would be, again, in looking at your test, for skin tone, it would be lighter, for weight, it would be thinner, for age, it would be younger. For mental illness, it would be more physical illness being the more preferred than mental illness. So the preferred or less preferred identities or characteristics. What did the privilege, empowerment, persecution, and discrimination look like for those in the respective groups, and how was it enforced? And then going to the results on page 9, think about your social position relative to the IAT, whether you're a member of that more privileged group or more preferred group or not, or are you somewhere in between, right? And then what impact did those enforcements and messages have on you? So it's now focusing it on you. How do you think the patterns of power relative to your position have been internalized? Have you experienced any feelings of guilt, pride, confusion, et cetera, mentioned in the core and result stages of the model? So we're actually going to give you about 10 minutes to complete this activity individually. It's 12:50 now. We'll give you until close to 1 o'clock to do that. And we are going to turn on some music to kind of give you some thinking music to do that. And really give you an opportunity to do a deep dive into this. Okay, so hopefully everybody had an opportunity to consider their cycle of socialization. We're not going to share this. This is really just going to be for you. But what I do want to do is move us now to something that we talked about in the last session. This is where we talked about policies, programs, practices, and people. And last session, we talked about the ways in which equity was applied to this. And what I'd like you to consider now that you have really thought about your biases and how you may have been socialized to have those biases, and I believe that the participant guide from last time has been shared in the chat. So you will be able to see what we did last time as it relates to policies, programs, practices, and people. But you do have this in your participant guide on page 10. What we'd like you to do now is think about how your biases that you discovered and your socialization affect the application, interpretation, or implementation of some of these policies, programs, practices, and people. This is something that we're going to ask you to share in the chat because we think that there's benefit in hearing from folks how we feel that our biases and socialization affect our policies, our programs, and our practices, our people. And so we'll give you a couple of minutes to think about that. And please do, once you have come up with some things, do share them in the chat, because I think, I believe Emily is going to monitor the chat to see what some of you may have to say related to that. So we'll give you about 5 minutes to work on that and give you some more music. Okay, do we have anything in the chat for folks to share the ways in which they think that their biases may affect policies, programs, practices, and people? Don't think we have anything.
We're looking for our first brave respondent.
You may still be working, perhaps.
Okay, let's see here. I've got one of them that came through privately. An example, actually, there's one of each of the four, so I'll read them one at a time. Policies, rethink self-evaluations as they may favor people that favor self-promotion. For programs, formal mentorship program in my firm to ensure everyone has one. Practices, make personnel decisions that are backed up with data and are explainable. And people, create opportunities for intergroup contact to get outside department and specialty.
Yeah, those are good. Yeah. And having an awareness of the fact that your biases may, with people, we tend to usually be in our own little silos, right? And so we often don't get a chance to interact between others. And you said that there was what was the one for policies again?
For policies, self-evaluations, to rethink them as they favor people that are like enjoy self-promotion.
Yeah, and I think there's a balance, that we have to strike between, those sort of policy decisions that we make that take into account personality, right? Okay, that's good. Any others that have come through?
Not yet.
Okay. Not yet. That's okay. I think it is fine for us to move along to the next one so that we have time for questions. Please do submit your questions into the question and answer. I'm trying to answer some of them independently, but some of them I'd like to answer in the large group. So feel free to share your perspectives on those. So let's move on to, again, I'm being very intentional about building on what we did in the very first session. If you remember in the first session, we shared with you Guides for Equitable Practice from the American Institute of Architects. And we had that in the first participant guide. We also have it in the participant guide for today, again, on pages 11 and 12. But in our efforts to build upon this, to think about these resources, and your participant guide really breaks down each of these resources after Towards Justice on page 10. You've got on pages 11 and 12, it talks about intercultural competence, workplace culture, compensation, recruitment and retention, negotiation, mentorship and sponsorship, advancing careers, engaging community, and measuring progress. And so now that we have done some of the work of knowing what our biases are, or some of us discovered that maybe we don't have any specific biases, but we want you to think about, again, we told you that this will be a lot about reflection. What is the application of implicit bias to these areas? And how might your biases be applied to their implementation, interpretation, or application? And what can you do to mitigate the impact of biases in these areas that are detailed by AIA? I saw something in a chat. So as a woman, I find I move towards the softer skill tasks in my company event planning and organizing. I wonder why this is. My socialization definitely categorized women as more relational and thoughtful. I assume this is why I see these tasks as unlikely to be picked up by men in the organization. Thank you for sharing that. I encourage you all to, there's a wonderful, wonderful video that we use in my work at UNT by Kristen Pressner called Flip It to Test It. That if I can find it, I'll put it in the chat. It's a really great video for you to think about these characteristics that we are ascribing to different individuals. And are we ascribing those characteristics because of our biases and because of our socialization? And she talks about flipping it to test it, in that, you know, we typically see men as taking charge and women as taking care. Would we find it weird if we flipped it and that we saw women as taking charge and men as taking care? And what would that look like in our firms if we flipped that and it was the women that were out there in the field and it was the men that were being organized and being having more of those softer skill tasks? So David, you had some thoughts here on the application of implicit biases to these areas, and maybe how your biases might be applied to implementation, and maybe what you can do to mitigate these biases. So would you like to share some of those with us?
Sure, I'll keep it relatively quick, Shani. You know, I looked at a number of the AIA areas there, and I kind of focused in on one that's close to mind at the moment, and it has to do with advancing careers. I probably could have come up with ideas and thoughts on a number of the other ones, but I focused on this one at the moment. So part of my role as a director at my firm is to help identify and develop talent to help our group forge a successful path in the future. And I found myself in a situation over the past few years where I'm now evaluating employees and colleagues with whom I've been peers with for many years, but am now senior to through promotions. So in particular, I review and discuss our associate directors with whom I was a peer for many years as an associate director. And some of them are very good personal friends with similar interests, while others are really more professional colleagues. And so there must be an affinity or similarity bias that I have related to the folks that I am closer friends with. And in addition, because I know all of them for a number of years and have interacted with them, I must also have an attribution bias where I really try to understand and explain to myself the behaviors based on my previous interactions with them. So, you know, these biases I'm aware of them, so they're maybe not implicit, but it's made it very challenging for me, and particularly for some others of you probably have been in this position where it comes time for recommendations for promotions, assigning annual bonuses, even performing reviews. Initially, I was very reluctant and uncomfortable performing reviews of people that I considered close personal friends. And it's particularly difficult comparing and contrasting them. The ones who are friends think and act more similarly to myself, so there's a potential favoritism I have to keep in mind during discussions. On the other hand, I don't want to overcorrect for any biases and penalize colleagues who are close friends. So, you know, what I do and what some of the folks in our firm try to do is have an objective set of criteria on which to evaluate the performance. And that helps, although it's still really hard to maintain objectivity. I also try to solicit, you know, additional input from others to inform and hopefully confirm my opinions. And where our firm in general is trying to increase transparency in our review and compensation processes and policies, which is also beneficial. Although being completely transparent with friends is very difficult. So, you know, I can see examples here related to policy. Our firm has kind of redone our policy related to appraisals and performance. And we now have a new guide, and we've trained people. So we have programs to train people in doing the reviews and to put together the review documents. You know, in practice, we've noted pitfalls to an effective performance, and a lot of the biases that we're talking about today have been identified and noted for people who are doing reviews. And then finally, related to people, our firm a few years ago created a committee called the TED Committee, which is called Talent, Equity, Diversity, and Development. And they kind of try to focus on some of these issues. And we did just hire a new, what we call a CPO, which is our head of human resources, and we call her a chief people officer. Which has really kind of changed the culture a little bit as to how we think of human resources in our office. So again, kind of very specific related to evaluations and advancing careers, but it was something close to mine, so I thought I'd share it.
I think that's really helpful, and it's, I hope that the folks on the call are finding these examples to be helpful, because what we really want is for you all to think about the application of each of these things in your respective areas so that you can go back and do something differently. And I will note that the video that I mentioned called "Are You Biased?" The video from Kristen Pressner is in the chat that NCSEA has put it in the chat for you all to access. It's really, really very good. I encourage you to watch it with this notion of flipping it to test it. Here's another comment in the chat. At my firm, we're reflecting upon our recruiting, interviewing, and hiring practices. We realized that we did not have a set structure on how to approach career fairs or interviews, so candidates are at the whims of the subjective views and implicit bias of the interviewers. Yep. Our goal is to write a guide playbook to help the interviewer and recruiter be aware of their biases and to eliminate implicit bias wherever we can in the hiring process. Oh, wow. And one of my students at Carey Academy just wrote this. This is, see, 2 degrees of separation. I wondered why your name sounded familiar, Jeffy. So Carey Academy in the house. So yes, so I'm glad that you all are thinking critically about this, that you are really thinking about what you're going to do differently. We encourage you to also think about what are some things that you can do differently. Before we move into our Q&A session, and I encourage more of you to include your questions in the Q&A. And it looks like there are some what folks are going to do differently coming into the chat. And we really just want to know what you can do as a member of the structural engineering community to be aware of and mitigate your implicit biases. So what are some of the things that are coming through in the chat there, Emily?
Yeah, we have a nice one from John. To watch my first impression, to be cautious and aware of how my brain goes to past experiences. Yeah,
that's a great example of I think that was the attribution bias, where you're attributing past experiences to current experiences. And the reality is, y'all, we do all of these. Diversity Lady does all of these. It's just a matter of being aware of the fact that we do them, that we have these biases, and they may creep up in different areas of our life, and that it may have an impact on creating an equitable and inclusive environment. Because the reality is, it's great to have a diverse environment, but if you're not practicing equity and inclusion, as we talked about last week, then you're not going to retain that diversity. So, okay, a couple more coming in the chat. What else do we have?
Perfect. We have structural engineering firms can do third-party salary and promotion audits to see how they're doing.
Yes. So say more about that, about how, do you want to talk more about what that looks like in structural engineering? Are salary audits usually done by partners or within the firm?
Yeah, I think this is something SE3 has championed, a recommendation that firms have an outside source come and look in at your salaries and compare them across different demographics. So I think SE3 has even put together some guides and best practices on how an engineering firm might go about doing that.
Awesome. Maybe that's something y'all can share.
Yeah.
Okay. What else do we have?
Let's see. We have learn more about stereotypes, so I know if I depend upon them.
Yeah, that's a big one. Biases and stereotypes go hand in hand, which is why I can't recommend enough the Flip It to Test It video. You'll find that to be very helpful.
Perfect. We have one here that asks, do evaluations evaluate for skills associated with diversity, equity, and inclusion?
That is a good one. And what I would first say is name the skills related to diversity, equity, and inclusion that you want to evaluate, and make sure that they're measurable. Because it's one thing to say, treats everyone with respect. Well, what does that look like? How do you quantify that? How do you qualify that? So maybe that's something that SC3 can even think about doing, is creating a guide for evaluation. I can certainly work with y'all on that. What else?
Perfect. Let's see here. We have to create opportunities for intergroup contact. Working with individuals of different groups is a good way to break down reliance on stereotypes.
Yes, intergroups, and I'm assuming, are we talking about social identity groups or even just our silos within engineering? Both of those could be a good way to kind of move beyond some of those stereotypes that we have. Yeah, what's another one?
Formalized mentorship. The impact of formal mentorship programs for underrepresented groups can be impactful.
Okay, yes, mentoring, and that's the other thing. Engage in cross-cultural mentoring too. That's a really great way to, one of the things that we say around our office is that proximity breeds empathy, right? And the more interaction that you have with people who are different, the more empathy you begin to develop towards those groups. So absolutely formalize mentoring and try to, where possible, engage in cross-cultural mentoring so that you can build that proximity and empathy.
That's
Do we have any more?
what we've got so far.
Okay, awesome. And so I wonder if this is a good time to go to the Q&A. There are a couple of really great questions that I've seen in the Q&A. I think there was one that came through in the chat, but I will address one of the ones that I see here that I really would love to answer, which is about affinity groups. And so it's, Shani, can you address the criticism that employee resource groups for people of color, women, et cetera, will contribute to affinity bias? Affinity groups, those are always one that creates a lot of discussion. Here's the reality that it's kind of like how we talked about cultural humility, and that you have to have an opportunity to look at your own perspectives, experiences, and interactions first, and develop that bonding capital that often happens where you even engage in those activities that we did last time, where you looked at, the top 3 things that had the most impact on your perspectives, experiences, and interactions. When you are able to do that with a group of folks that have your same identity or same background, much like what we're doing here as structural engineers, thinking about how this affects our policies, programs, practices, and people within structural engineering, we're developing that bonding capital together so that we can go forth and maybe do some collaborations on some of these things together. That is the thing about employee resource groups and affinity groups. They are building bonding capital so that folks within those groups, when they get together, they realize they are not the only people who are experiencing some of these identity-based experiences within your firm. And it helps with retention, because even if you can create some employee resource groups that are within the association, if you don't have very many people within your firm, I guarantee you that having those opportunities for people in your firms to talk with people that are like them will show them this is just par for the course within our firms. Some things it may even encourage them to build that bridging capital so that you're working with folks across other firms and sharing best practices like what we're doing here, so that you can think of ways in which you can leverage those identities of those folks within your affinity groups for business purposes. It can help you with getting additional contracts. It can help you with recruiting additional folks within your firm that are from more diverse backgrounds. So what I would say is, let go of the idea that letting folks come together, just like we're coming together here, is a bad thing. Your employees who are members of underrepresented groups will appreciate it, because I guarantee that they often feel like islands in an ocean, not having other folks to share their perspectives with. So that's low-hanging fruit, is starting employee resource groups where your employees can connect with each other, and also consider doing them if you don't have a lot of diversity within your own respective firm, maybe doing some employee resource groups across firms so that you can build collaboration as well. I'm looking at some of these other questions. There was another one I wanted to answer live. How is it possible to avoid contrast bias and evaluating candidates for a job? Is it even appropriate to try? And then maybe David, you can look through some of these other ones.
Sure.
Yeah, contrast bias, that's why I admitted that this is one that I struggle with. Here's what I would say. As you are looking at candidates, stop at each one and identify pros and cons for each. So after you do one, we automatically sometimes go to the pros, right? There are great things about this candidate, but then think about the limitations that this candidate may have, and ask yourself that for every single candidate, so that you're not just like, oh my goodness, this candidate is great. And then you realize you're not necessarily doing that for every candidate, that you're not finding the great things in every candidate. You're talking more about how that candidate measures up to the one that came before them or the one that came after them. So that's what I would say. We just went through a pretty rigorous process where we had a search committee and we had people rate folks on the search committee, and we used very objectively our search committee's data to make our hiring decision. So you might want to also engage other people in your search process to make sure that you don't have groupthink. I did want to mention here that I know we're at 128. Last time we did our Q&A, we allowed it to go beyond. I'm perfectly happy to stay till 1:45, but we're just acknowledging here that we are running up on 1:30, and so that if people need to leave, they can, but I'm happy to answer questions until we're done.
Well, thanks, Shani. I have another one here. I have a racially diverse staff. How can I touch base with them appropriately to see how I am doing with regards to diversity, equity, and inclusion?
That is a great question. The first thing I would say is do a culture pulse check. Do some sort of culture survey, climate survey. It's something that goes beyond just identifying what the demographics are, but how, on a scale of 1 to 10, how included do you feel? Do you feel like everyone is held accountable to the same standards? Do you feel like that you're able to bring your whole self to work? If that's something that you're interested in, you can certainly feel free to reach out to me. I'm on LinkedIn as Shani Barracks Moore. There are also other surveys out there. The Gallup survey, a lot of people use for engagement, although it doesn't really get to the specific diversity, equity, and inclusion question. So I would encourage you to think about, begin with the end in mind. What is it that you want to know? And then move backwards in asking those questions about what drives engagement in your organization, and seeing if those folks who are members of historically underrepresented groups are engaging at the same level.
Okay, thank you. I've got another one here. I am mindful that I have biases, but in the heat of the moment, I need to make decisions. I may lose perspective and actions become more reactive. How do I make sure I am more mindful in my decision making?
Yeah, I think that's something we all struggle with. And that's why I shared with y'all the gift of cultural humility is constantly, as I said, checking yourself before you wreck yourself or other people. The other thing that I would say is do watch that Kristen Pressner Flip It to Test It. And basically what she says is, in that moment, flip it to test it. So say, for example, if you know that you have biases, and you're trying to make a decision in the moment, flip that person. So if it's say a woman that you're trying to make a decision about, let's say if it was a man, and put someone else in that spot and flip it to test it to see if you would make the decision differently. That way, you may have some biases, and then go back and try to look objectively at that decision. It may take longer, but what I would offer you is that it's better to say, can I think on that for a moment? Rather than making decisions in the moment, because the reality is sometimes decisions in the moment are based on snap judgments, and that's not always what we want to base our decisions on.
Great. Here's another one, Shani. How do we deal with the fact that diversity and inclusion can be seen as a charity towards minorities? I have seen it lead to what I call the nice gal guy syndrome, where people expect to be rewarded for doing the right thing.
That's a really great question. I would say first, identify how diversity, equity, and inclusion fits within your business purpose, right? If it's just diversity for diversity's sake, then you can really think more strategically and critically about what different perspectives do I expect different people to bring into my firm? How can I leverage those different perspectives? What are some business goals that you have within your firm? And then figuring out how they can answer those. And I would also say, so as not to practice paternalism, make sure that you give those folks a place at the table to be part of those decisions, so that you are not doing unto them, that you are engaging them with how do you see your diversity and your diversity of perspectives being beneficial to this firm. And you might be surprised to hear what they tell you.
Okay, great. Here's another. Recruiting is a big challenge. You referenced historically Black college and universities in the previous webinar. How do I make our firm more inviting to a more diverse hiring base? Right now, when someone walks in, we are almost all white and mostly male.
Yeah, so that's good that you acknowledge that you're mostly white and mostly male. I would still, you can be honest with folks and let them know that, you know, we are early on our diversity and inclusion journey, that you might want to create, and this came up in the last session, create a role that is specifically designed for college outreach. I would ask, you know, what does your standard recruitment process look like? Can that be expanded so that, you know, if you are going to the same schools that you have historically always gone to, can you switch it up a little bit and maybe go to North Carolina A&T State University? Again, I'm from North Carolina, so I'm always repping North Carolina schools, but Florida A&M University, and talk to their career connect folks, to folks in their career centers, and see if they even have some recommendations for what you can do to make your firm more intentionally inclusive. Oftentimes, though, they would have primed their students for, you're not going into an environment like you just experienced the last 4 years in a predominantly Black college and institution. But I think if you have a plan, and if you know the ways in which you think that these diverse perspectives are going to enhance your organization, you can leverage that going beyond tokenism, but maybe even having those folks to be tasked with starting, say, an employee resource group, or maybe being engaged with SC3 or some of those initiatives that we have going on nationally, so that they are not in a way that is tokenizing, but that you are giving them empowerment as to how they think they can leverage their difference within the firm.
Okay, we've got a couple more. Do you have advice for staff engineers leading DEI initiatives at firms on how to balance pushing for difficult conversations on racial justice and partnering with leadership who may be nervous about controversy?
Here's the thing. This stuff is often hard to talk about, but not talking about it is not going to make it go away. So what I would say is bring in an experienced facilitator that knows how to facilitate these discussions, that knows how to read the room and read when things are sort of getting controversial, that knows where the starting point should be. You know, I often tell people, you don't want to start with talking about privilege. That's like the next to last thing that you should talk about. So, I mean, this is why there are so many diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioners whose services are being used right now, because they are going to know how to assess your organization for what the starting point is, so that there is someone outside facilitating these discussions, and it's not the messenger, right, that has started these discussions and then maybe is punished for having them. So I would say find some external resources, and I'm certainly able to help folks find some resources that can help with those types of discussions.
We had another one come in, Shani, that's interesting. Any tips for combating patting ourselves on the back mindset? I have encountered some of that as I try to raise the topic of DEI within my firm.
This again goes back to, I would lean on your SE3 teams here, because there should be some strategic imperative for why it is we're doing that. And here's what I will say. If your firm is predominantly white, predominantly male, and doesn't have a lot of diversity, then there's no reason for them to pat themselves on the back, right? I think if you're looking at what's missing, what perspectives are missing at the table, what reason didn't we get that last contract, tying it back to your business purpose. And the reality is there's some people that may say, we're doing fine. You know, there is no business purpose. But I promise you, when the next firm over does this work and they are able to tie it to their business and purpose and their business imperative, you're going to see why you shouldn't have been patting yourselves on the back, and that you should have been starting at the very beginning with, again, policies, programs, practices, and people. If you weren't in the last session, maybe even just taking what we did in the last session and talking about what you can do to make your policies, programs, practices, and people more equitable and inclusive, starting from there and then working towards those goals, because there's always something that we can be doing. The reality is there's always something that we can be doing. So just start somewhere, maybe with some low-hanging fruit so that folks get comfortable. You know, maybe it's, we just want to diversify our next incoming hiring class. Maybe we're going to add a HBCU to our recruitment strategy, but do something. You can't pat yourself on the back unless you're actually doing something.
Great. Okay, so we have one last question here. Do you have recommendations on how to bring all this back to the workplace for discussion and action? People will be defensive, especially when discussing HR practices. How do I start the process in my small firm?
Well, and I would pose this to SCA. I think one thing might be to have them watch these sessions to know that, you know, diversity and inclusion is not scary, that you can actually learn something by engaging in self-reflection, and maybe even just using the participant guide, having them watch it, using the participant guide, and maybe doing it as a lunch and learn, so that everybody is talking about their policies, practices, programs, and people, and how you can make it more equitable. I'm happy to help however I can, but I think you've got some great resources here in having access to these sessions. And, you know, feel free to share the participant guide and just get them to think about what your starting point is. Everybody's starting point is going to be different, but just start somewhere, and having them kind of go through this process in a way that is non-threatening may be helpful.
Great. So thanks so much, Shani, for all your help. I'm going to thank the NCSEA staff, Kat, Leo, Al, and others. And on behalf of NCSEA, we'd like to thank all of you for your participation in today's event. To view the recording of the presentation, it will be posted on the NCSEA website later this week. To continue the conversation, we hope you join us at the Virtual Structural Engineering Summit on November 5th for the panel presentation, How Do We Progress Towards Racial Equity in the Structural Engineering Community? If you are unable to attend the session live, a recording will be available complimentary after the summit concludes. This concludes today's program. Thank you and have a great day.